Hi, this is part 8 of my multi-video series on ancient Egypt. This video, or I'm going to start this video by going more deeply into the unification of ancient Egypt and what that process or processes may have looked like. My name is Hannah Mail, and I offer his history sessions either in person or via webcam on ancient Egypt and ancient history for $10 to $20 an hour. So let's get started. So as this slide says, I'm going to be talking in more detail about the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and some of the founding figures that may have been involved in that. Partly or mainly at this point, King Menes / King Narmer. And you'll see why there's those two names are different with the next slide. All right, so if you've watched the earlier, or if you've watched some of the earlier content in this series, you might know that the territory of ancient Egypt in terms of its geography was roughly divided into Lower and Upper Egypt, and because of the way that the Nile ran and still runs, it's opposite directionally from what you would think. So Lower Egypt is actually up here in the Delta region where modern day Cairo and Giza is, and Upper Egypt is down here on the map where modern day Luxor, ancient Thebes were, and Valley of the Kings and Queens, and kind of that part of Egypt. So before the unification of those two geographical regions, there were multiple separate cultures living along the Nile River and in the Delta and elsewhere in the Nile Basin in Egypt. The approximate date for the permanent unification of Upper and Egypt, or Upper and Lower Egypt happening is somewhere around 3,500 to 3,000 BCE. And this took place, the mechanisms for this taking place are not clear, and the exact length of how long this process took is not clear either. So once you have unification, somewhere at the end of Naqada 3, you then start with the early dynastic period. So that starts Egypt's existence as a unified, independent political entity. As I said, the rulers and exactly how long this process took is something that's still being figured out and probably will never be fully figured out. However, by the Middle Kingdom, the royal ideology that had kind of come to coalesce around the origin story of the state was this. Years, way back in the deep mist of time, we had this ruler named Menes who started out as just one of these local rulers, but he decided at some point to unite Upper and Lower Egypt. He was also the one that supposedly founded the capital of Memphis, and he supposedly founded Memphis where he did because it was in a good boundary zone between Upper and Lower Egypt in terms of communications getting quickly to him from either one of those ends. So in the 19th century, when Egyptology is getting established as a discipline, archaeological evidence of this Menes figure is one of the first thing that Egyptologists set out to find. They don't find evidence of him, but they do find evidence of this early ruler named Narmer around the same time, who seems to do, at least in part, a similar thing. So one of the current theories is that this figure, Menes, never actually existed, but was basically a compilation of all the rulers that were involved in this unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, including Narmer, and they just over time all kind of got amalgamated into this one mythical founder person. So that is the kind of background, the basic background to the unification of the Egyptian state. Part of the wrinkle in recent years has been before Narmer, who is usually put in the first dynasty. Before his dynasty, there also seems to have been an earlier group of rulers that had control over at least some parts of Egypt, which is the rulers that this dynasty 0 period is talking about. And it's dynasty 0 because earlier content in this series, I've talked about how the dynasty system came to kind of fruition with this Ptolemaic priest named Mana, though archaeology has proven enough of kind of his broad system to be correct, even if you didn't get all the details right, that modern Egyptology has left that system in place. The issue with the unification and kind of the founding of the Egyptian state is that Narmer was already part of Dynasty 1. So when archaeology started uncovering evidence of this earlier dynasty, that even if they didn't control all of Egypt, they were involved in trying to extend their amount of control that they had. There was already a Dynasty 1. So that's why this earlier group was given the name Dynasty 0, because they're trying to stay within that dynastic system. So this is both sides of the Narmer palette, which is one of the most important objects that we have, that seems to have been made around the time of unification. And it is called the palette because it comes from an original class of objects that were palettes that were functional. So these were objects that were in the shape of different stones that were used to ground up makeup or ground up pigments. So they had in the center of one of the sides of the palette, they had a edge or a part that was deeper that you would actually do the mixing in. And on this ceremonial palette, you can see an echo of that space here. What you see in the Naqada 2 through Naqada 3, and definitely by the tail end of the pre-dynastic, and is kind of bound up with the formation of the state and the emergence of the state, is these ceremonial palettes like this one. So they're larger, so they clearly are too big to be functional, and they're a ceremonial use. And the reason that this particular one is called the Narmer palette is because it depicts King Narmer. So it depicts one of those early rulers that was involved in the unification. And because this object was first found in the 19th century. And again, you see both sides of it here. And the kind of earlier 19th century majority interpretation of this object was that it showed the straightforward depiction of Narmer conquering. I forget if it was conquering upper or lower Egypt, but it was conquering one of them, and there's been this big battle, and he's been successful, and now he's asserting his unification. The more current interpretation, or one of the more current possibilities, is that maybe this doesn't show a historical battle, but it shows more like what Narmer wished to happen or kind of wished to do. So there's within definitely the past couple of decades, the fine tuning of the interpretation of the Narmer palette has definitely shifted, and there's more questions now about what it actually may be showing. I put it here because it is one of the objects that has a lot of the early hallmarks of Egyptian art in terms of artistic conventions and motifs that you will see crop up and used in elite and royal art all the way past the New Kingdom. So if you look at this side here, one of the first things that you'll notice is the Narmer is this figure here. And we know he is Narmer because his name is in the Sirrek there. But if you look at the size of him, he is the biggest figure in the composition. And this technique of using size to show you how important different people are is something that you'll see repeatedly used in Egyptian and elite art. You also have, if you look at the way that the scenes are organized, somewhat here, but even more clearly on this side, you see that there's clear registers or bands, and each one is separated. That idea of depicting things on regimented registers or bands is something else that will stay with Egyptian elite art and artistic conventions for these 3,000 plus years. So this is a link that is in the description box that goes into more depth of what each of these individual scenes may be telling you. And so I've put that there if you want to dive more deeply into it, but I at least wanted to mention this object and kind of some of the things that it's most well known for, because it is one of those really important objects that is tied up with the emergence of the Egyptian state in some way. Oh, and the other thing that again, motif that you see surface over and over in terms of how the ruler's depicted is you see here, he is about to club down an enemy that he has by the hair. That striking motif is something else or is another pose that you will see the ruler depicted in over and over and over. And that being said, there are some things that the Narmer palette does that don't last in the Egyptian iconography and kind of way of doing things, because part of the emergence of the Egyptian state that we see in these objects, the Narmer palette is just one of them, seem to also be the elite at that time who later will kind of gain this full status as Pharaoh, kind of experimenting with how they want to show their power and how they want to depict themselves. So not everything that they use or allow to be used stays in the artistic canon. All right. And then I've talked about in the earlier content how Egypt in ancient times was the country of Egypt, but then they also in in upper, they also had their border with ancient Nubia or Kush, which in modern day geography is mostly where Sudan is now in those areas because there's conflict there where it's not geographically stable. And within that Nubian area, there is 6 major cataracts. So the first cataract is the basically marks the Egyptian border with uh Aswan and the temple of Abu Simbel. And then the rest of the cataracts, which are numbered here, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, which okay, so 6 is out of the frame. But what these cataracts are is they are sections of the Nile that are very rocky. And so they're basically natural barriers. And when the annual flood was still happening, these cataracts would be flooded at certain times of the year. And that was what allowed you during those times of the year to actually sail through them. But when the Nile was not in flood, it was much harder / near impossible to get boats through the cataracts, in particular through the first cataract. And so you would have to or one of the ways that they approached this was they would disassemble boats, drag them on the banks over the cataract, and then put them back together once they got past the rocks. One of the other facets of ancient Egyptian culture that has received more focus in recent decades is their entanglement and their relations with ancient Nubia or ancient Kush, as they also refer to it. So it was known, or it was figured out back in the 19th century when Egyptology was first getting started as a discipline in the West, that the Egyptian state, starting in the Old Kingdom, had different levels of diplomatic relationships with the people that were living in ancient Nubia or Kush. However, because Egyptology as a discipline in the West was intimately entangled and bound up with the development and growth of things like imperialism and scientific racism of the time, those colonial relations between the Egyptian state and ancient Nubia or Kush were viewed relatively linearly and relatively simply. And the kind of Western Orientalist imperialist colonial model with the racism that is inherent in all of those, or that was / is inherent in all of those things, was applied to the evidence that Egyptologists found about the relations of the Egyptian state with ancient Nubia or Kush. So in the past few decades, that topic has been approached with fresher eyes and the Nubians and or slash ancient Kushites have been given more agency, and we've tried to kind of decolonize how we looked at those pieces of evidence. So that's why I've labeled this chart Egyptian entanglement, and I thought I had the reference of where I got this chart on the slide, but I do not, so I will put that reference in the description box. But what I've done here, because this is the major periods of the Nubian cultures or civilizations, starting from the Neolithic and then going through going through part of the Islamic period. And what I've done is I've put with the red arrows the approximate Egyptian chronology points that overlap with these Nubian periods, starting from the Neolithic to the New Kingdom. So I chose this chart partly because I wanted to center the Nubians front and center, and show Egypt overlaid within that. So this is from a larger article that again takes the major periods of the Egyptian dynasties, starting from the New Kingdom through the late period, and matches them with the periods of Nubian dynasties and chronology for both lower and upper Nubia. So again, just kind of when if you get really interested in this topic, I just put these two charts here to kind of give you some sense of the terminology that is out there. So that if you start to read an article and you read something about the C group, you don't go, what's that? This, I'm hoping, at least gives you a little bit of a frame of reference for kind of where to place that. One of the sources of evidence that we have for ancient Egypt is their literature. And part of the challenges, but also kind of I envision it as the fun of looking at Egyptian literature, is figuring out exactly what genres of Egyptian writings we should place under the term literature. Because one of the genre of writings that we have from ancient Egypt is on the walls of the tomb complexes, so not the actual burial chamber of the body, but the above ground part where the living were expected and kind of hoped to come to give offerings, and kind of interact with the spirits of the deceased. On some of those tomb walls from the Old Kingdom on, we have autobiographies that the owner had inscribed on his tomb wall. Because as far as I know, all of the tomb autobiographies that we have so far are for male officials. And so this is kind of one of those categories where we're not exactly sure where to put it, because it's clear that this is like actual autobiographical stories of people who actually lived and existed in real historical time. But at the same time, it's clear that when you read the autobiographies, over time, they're kind of developed ways to write these and kind of formats to write these, and they wanted these to sound good. And so that's why they're kind of in this nebulous place where they're kind of literature, but also not. So just kind of to give you some background there. But these tomb autobiographies are one of our windows into the dynastic history, and into the kind of life of the court, because more than one of these officials served more than one ruler. So it's one of our windows into the kind of political and dynastic court history. The reason that I put this slide here is because one of the things that the tomb autobiographies also talk about, is starting from the Old Kingdom. Many, or at least a few of these male officials were sent by the ruler, to do military campaigns and basically military raids, into Nubia to acquire resources for the Egyptian state. So these tomb autobiographies are also used to kind of give us a window and to reconstruct, at least in part, what Egypt's relationships with the Nubian state and people were, and Nubian polities that emerged in different times were. So this is one of the more famous ones that has those elements, the tomb autobiography of Weni. This was found in the 19th century, so this is a 19th century image of both sides of the part of the wall where the biography was. And then this is a translation of part of that autobiography from a book that I also really recommend if you want to really dive into the variety of Egyptian literature, called Literature of Ancient Egypt: An Anthology of Stories, Instructions, Stele Autobiographies, and Poetry by William Kelly Simpson. One of the advantages of this book is that it goes into the late period, in terms of literature and stories that were circulating around. So it is a thicker book, which means it's more expensive. But I think it's worth the buying it in physical form, but also, at least the last time I looked, if you go on Internet Archive, a PDF of this book has been scanned and put on that site that you can download as well. But this is one of the books that personally I think it is worth spending the money for an actual paper physical copy. But that's up to you. So Winnie the Elder, in his tomb autobiography, talks about some of these expeditions to Nubia that the ruler sent him on. So His Majesty sent me at the head of this army, ... So I was there's words in there that I left out, as well as the Nubians of these foreign lands. And what we think he means here is Nubian mercenaries that were employed or utilized by the Egyptian state somehow. So, and again, this tomb autobiography dates to the Old Kingdom. So even as far back as the Old Kingdom, we're seeing different levels of complexity and different people's aims and desires from Nubia or Kush in kind of dealing with and interacting with the Egyptian state. And for a long time, Winnie's tomb autobiography, parts of his tomb were known and found, but because that autobiography was originally found in the 19th century, um, the location of Winnie's actual tomb was lost. So the original 19th century Egyptologist who found the autobiography dismantled those wall sections with the autobiography on them, and then the location of the tomb itself was lost. So Penn Museum, as well as I think in a collaboration with the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, um, has done archaeological work to basically try to find Winnie's original tomb. So in the description box, I've put some links that go into that in more detail if you, again, want to dive in more deeply. So they were able, or at least they think they were able to find Winnie's original tomb, which is located at Abydos in the Middle Cemetery. So that's what this graphic is. It is just showing you a image of kind of where Winnie's tomb is in the larger archaeological landscape of Abydos. And this is kind of going even more deeply into that middle cemetery. And this is the actual tomb of Winnie that they think the autobiography was originally inscribed in. You also have another well-known tomb autobiography from the Old Kingdom that was again first found in the second half of the 19th century in 1890, which is the tomb autobiography of Harkuf. So this is his actual tomb autobiography that was basically on the exterior wall / door of his tomb. So you see Harkuf here. So this is one that has stayed in place from when it was found till now. So this is an excavation photo from the 19th century when they first found this and were digging it out and starting to translate the text. So you can see that they still have to at this point they still have to remove a fair amount of rock to get at this door. And again, when I was talking about temples and how particularly the kind of state design of New Kingdom temples was as you went further and further into the interior space and access became more and more restricted, but how if you look at the modern day or what's left of the temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor, which largely date from the New Kingdom and after in terms of what actually survives on the ground, you'll see a lot of these big gaping spaces that you have to imagine doors in. And so it's similar here where when this autobiography was found, this is the entrance to the tomb chapel. And to us, it just looks like a big and gaping space where like, okay, anybody could just walk in, like that's not secure. But likely when this tomb chapel was in use, and being visited, this space did have a door or some sort of barrier that could be open and closed. So, just kind of keep that in mind. And then this is that same tomb with because John Hopkins has done more recent archaeological work on that space. And so this is one of their images from some of the archaeological work that they've done on Harkuf's tomb, and you can see his tomb autobiography here with a picture of him here, on either side of the door, which again, speaking to the Narmer's palette and how size already is being used as an indicator of importance and kind of showing who's top tier. If you look at the size of Harkuf, he is the biggest thing, or biggest person in this space, and that kind of tells you something about the importance of this figure. So Memphis, as one of Egypt's main capitals, was in existence and being used definitely by the Old Kingdom, possibly even earlier. And then in varying degrees, it was used as one of the capitals of Egypt post New Kingdom. What shifted, or what mainly shifted after the Old Kingdom, was that Memphis stopped being used as the political, or as the main political and religious center of the Egyptian state. Because when you get to the Middle Kingdom, you see the rise of ancient Thebes, modern day Luxor, as the main religious capital and religious space in terms of state involvement and state investment in Egypt. But it wasn't like everybody then moved out of Memphis and it ceased to exist. It was just used in a different way. So that's kind of something to keep in mind is that the Egyptian state at different points in time had kind of multiple and contending capitals depending on what the political situation was on the ground. So in terms of the majority of archaeological remains for Memphis that we have, the largest remains and kind of the most extensive are within and outside the modern village of Mitrina. So in the general environment or general area of the Cairo region, and during the 19th century, that getting to Cairo, getting to Cairo from Mitrina or vice versa was a lot less urban, and a lot of the kind of delta, or at least more of the delta and original flora and fauna were still there. As Cairo's urban population expanded, that changed. All right, I'm going to pause it here and stay tuned for part 9 of this multi-content series. Bye.